The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Answer the Freaking Question. It's probably, over the many years that I've hosted the Atheist Experience and other call-in shows, the most frustrating point that I have to deal with. And that is, for those of us who've spent some time studying how people tend to get things wrong, how arguments go wrong, why are logical arguments important, why are fallacious arguments problematic, and it's not because a fallacious argument means the conclusion isn't true. A fallacious argument means that we can't tell whether or not the conclusion is true or not. But for the people who genuinely want to have conversations where they expose flaws in thinking, some of us have gotten fairly careful with our language. There are things that I don't say now that I know I used to say way back when. There are things that I've changed how I talk about them. We'll get into one of those a little bit later. But when you get to the point where you're pretty decent at having these conversations, you know which questions to ask to steer the conversation towards the realization that there's something not right here. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about gods or ghosts or ghouls or whatever. When you start to ask questions, the purpose is to expose that someone has reached a conclusion that's unjustified. One thing that pops into my head immediately was from yesterday's episode of the Atheist Experience, where someone had basically said they saw a ghost. And I'm like, how do you know it was a ghost? It's a simple, straightforward question. And what we're trying to do there is get them to say, okay, I reached this conclusion for these reasons. Quite often, when I ask a question on the show, I don't get an answer to that question. I've spent a great deal of time thinking about this. There are a lot of reasons. I'm not going to address every single possible reason because, maybe a dog barked or there was a hiccup on the line or some sort of audio problem. But one of the reasons that I'm mentioning this is because, unlike what some people might think, I'm constantly looking for ways to get better, looking for ways to all of us get better, implementing a 30-second time on callers that if they're doing well, they're going to get 30 seconds and they'll get more time if they're actually answering questions and making points, has turned out to be a big help to the show and to the conversations. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about why people don't answer the question, what may be going on, how I deal with it, how I'm making some changes to how I deal with it. And I want to solicit your input down in the comments. What do you think about this? What are your other reasons why people are just avoiding the questions? What other things can we do? And how else can we change how we talk about these things to get better conversations? So soliciting some feedback from you guys. So the first thing that pops into my head when someone doesn't answer the question that I asked is, what was their response? Was their response an attempted answer to some question, or did they just continue down the path that they were already going? Because it's possible that they may not have heard the question. This is still a problem, and it means that they are not listening with the intent of carrying on a conversation. If they didn't hear the question, it may be because they're just waiting for their next turn to make the next point. And so everything you've said has gone in one ear and out the other. And all they're waiting for is a pause in the blah, 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 where they can then continue making their point. If I suspect that this is what's happening, I'll often just call them out on it. Yesterday, I called out somebody for clearly not listening and for just going on with, you're wanting to preach. You're not wanting to have a conversation. You're not wanting to give the reason why You're convinced of what you're convinced of. The other thing is that they may have misheard the question. And this usually is when they start answering some question, and they're convinced they're answering the question you asked, but they haven't. And this happens for a number of reasons. One is that there are with religious and supernatural, superstitious ideas, protective measures in there, where the reasoning that they've used to reach this conclusion is in place as a sort of cocoon around all thoughts related to that discussion. And so if they have reached the conclusion because the Bible says so, and this carries with it a bunch of baggage that they think the Bible is a good source and is reliable, and that if it says something, it's likely true, then when you ask, why do you believe this? And they say, it's in the Bible, they're answering the question you asked pretty directly. But if you ask, what evidence do you have for what you're saying? And they say, well, it's in the Bible. They may not be answering the question you asked so much as the question they think you asked, because they're anticipating some objections, but not others. And so if somebody says that this was a ghost, and I say, why do you believe it was a ghost? What can you answer? You have to explain why this thing that you think you experienced is best described as being a ghost. And then it gets into questions of, how do you know what a ghost is? How do you know what a spirit is? How do you know what supernatural is? How do you know this? And all of those questions exist and are there to get to the heart of why we make mistakes in reasoning. So they might not have heard the question. They might have misheard the question. One thing that happens frequently is that they could be assuming that they're being faced with a trick question. Now, there are dishonest trick questions, like, have you stopped beating your spouse? Obviously, if you say yes, then the implication is that you used to. And if you say no, then the implication is that you're still doing it. Flawed questions like that need to be exposed because they are not conducive to conversation. But what a lot of people are assuming when they assume there's a trick question is that if I ask you, what justification do you have for claiming that it's a ghost? If they assume that the question is being phrased in such a way that they will be tricked into giving an answer that will expose that they're wrong. And one thing worth remembering is that if you can be tricked into acknowledging that you're wrong, you're wrong. If you're acknowledging that you're wrong, you're wrong. So there's a number of things that I'm going to try to start doing. And as I've said in the past, I want to get feedback from you guys on how else to deal with it. But if it seems like somebody's not answering the question, I will ask the question again. One thing I'm going to start trying to do is, if they don't get it right after the second time I've asked the question, is to ask them to repeat or restate what the question is. Because quite frankly, they may be answering a question that they thought they heard, but it's not what I actually said. And we need to correct that until they get the question correct that shows, I understand what you're asking, and now I'm going to try to answer it. And if they still don't answer that question, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily dealing with a troll. Most of you aren't going to be on a show like the Atheist Experience, although I hope you try and start one. But in that situation, if you can say, hey, why are you convinced that what you saw was a ghost? And they say, okay, I hear you. You're asking me why I'm convinced that what I saw was a ghost. And then they go on to answer some other question. You have to point that out. You have to say, look, I asked this question, you repeated this question, and then you answered some other question entirely. It's one thing to reformulate a question, and you can do that if there's some disagreement about the terms. But don't reformulate your question so that it's a question they want to answer, unless the question they want to answer is also what you wanted answered. To say, why do you believe this? How do you know this? Why call it supernatural? Why call it a ghost? These are all just questions that are trying to get to the heart of the communication. Because if somebody tells me they've seen a ghost, I have something in my head that I can imagine, because I've heard ghost stories. I've never seen a ghost myself, never seen anything that I thought was a ghost, at least not in that context. But I have things that are in my head, and so do most people. And we rely on the common understanding between us to say, oh, I know what they're talking about when they say they experience a ghost. There's a reason I don't do that on the show, even though it may be true. There's a reason why I say, I don't know what you mean by spiritual. I don't know what you mean by supernatural, because I don't know what they mean. I think I might know what somebody else means, and we may have enough commonality in our understanding of it that we could have a conversation. But if we're going to be talking about whether or not the supernatural is real, you have to dig in a little bit more. So, questions for you guys. How many times are you likely to keep asking the question? When do you throw up your hands and give up? How flexible are you going to be in rephrasing the question? There's language that I've changed. I still will use the term believe, and I still talk about belief and knowledge. But when I talk about like defining atheism, it's not so much that I say a theist believes a God exists and an atheist does not believe a God exists. I tend to try to frame that in the terms of you are convinced that a God exists and you are not convinced that a God exists. Because I think the convinced, not convinced, even though it's synonymous with believe, not believe, I think that resonates better with some people. And you can talk about how becoming convinced is the result of a process of you being presented with claims and evidence in support of those and then reaching conclusions. There are questions that we ask where we can change language similarly. And it's not just about why call that supernatural. It can be, what makes you think that your understanding of what you experienced is accurate? How do you know it wasn't an illusion, a delusion, a deception, a hallucination? You know, you start rattling off other potential things. That can work against you because it looks like you're offering up potential solutions. And if they can knock down all those, then their original one stands. And that would be a fallacy as well, to say, well, you all offered up 10 alternate propositions and we knocked them all down, which means my original one wins, even though that's not how that works at all. Just because we proved it wasn't the maid or the gardener, that doesn't mean that a butler actually did it. The most common kind of areas where this is coming up is when people are trying to relay a story, and we are all prone to injecting our conclusions in, and then we're all prone to lying. We're prone to exaggerating. We are prone to, I know you're not going to believe me, but here's the thing, and I know that I know that I know that I know. And so they start using language like that. To ask, what else could it be, is the most common response that you're going to get once you push somebody into actually answering the question or coming close to answering the question. And we saw this yesterday. We see it on a regular basis. And that is, what's the justification for you calling it a ghost? How do you know it's a ghost? Eventually, when they get to acknowledge that they don't have a good reason to conclude what I experienced was a ghost, then they'll get to the point where they say, what else could it be? This is a version of the argument from ignorance fallacy, the notion that something is true until it's proven false or false until it's proven true. Essentially, they're saying, my explanation stands until you can offer a better explanation. And as noted just a moment ago, that's not the way it works. But when you ask the questions and push them and hold their feet to the fire to say, okay, I need you to answer this question, then they'll often get to a point where they say, well, I don't know that it's a ghost, but what else could it be? And now you can talk about fallacious reasoning. And it's better, don't use the labels, the argument for ignorance labels I pointed out before. It's better to come up with an example. And the more absurd the example is, it may be better. And so how do you know that it wasn't a mental projection from a zebra that was walking in your backyard? That's so out of left field that now they have to process, hang on, there was a zebra walking in my backyard and it mentally projected an image up to me. And so it wasn't a ghost, but now there's some other supernatural thing. The tendency or the instinct is to just say, well, that's ridiculous. And that's the point. Because they've decided that another unfalsifiable proposition that is in fact supernatural or seems to be supernatural is absolutely ridiculous, and they've dismissed it. And yet their preferred, also ridiculous supernatural explanation, they have gone with and went with it. And now you get to dig into why. And usually it's because on some level, they've grown up indoctrinated into the idea that ghosts and spirits are real because religions are real and gods are real. And psychic zebras aren't a real thing. You may not make much headway there because there are a lot of defensive mechanisms for religion, and we'll talk some more about those in the future as well. But asking better questions and forcing people to actually answer the question asked are huge in having better conversations. And if you can't do that one-on-one, if you can't say, okay, if you're not going to answer this question, then we're just going to end the conversation, or we'll come back to it. Feel free to go ahead and think about it and get back to me on that. But if you're not going to answer the question that's asked, I don't see how we can continue to have this conversation, because I'm not just going to sit here and be preached at. And if all you're going to do is dodge the actual questions that are designed to show whether or not you have a good reason, then I don't know how else to proceed. Once you get that done, I think you can hopefully start to have better conversations. And I hope that you can start seeing it on the Atheist Experience and Hang Up and other places where we are trying to give people a little more time and trying to hold their feet to the fire to some extent on making sure they answer the question that was asked. Because if we're going to go to all the trouble to come up with better and better questions to expose flaws in thinking, we have to make sure that people are actually taking the time to try to answer those questions, or at least acknowledge what the question is, even if they ultimately admit that they don't have an answer. And not having an answer, saying, I don't know, is also the start of learning and discovery and a pathway out of pretending that you do know. See you next time. Bye-bye.